Prison Writings. My Life is My Sundance by Leonard Peltier. Part 2. Who I Am. I am an Indian man. My only desire is to live like one. Chapter 9. My life is an Indian life. I'm a small part of a much larger story. If I ever have the years of freedom necessary to write another book, I'll appear in it only as a minor character. The personal specifics of my life are unimportant. Being an Indian, that's what's important. My autobiography is the story of my people, the Indian people of this great turtle island. My life has meaning only in relation to them. It's insignificant in and of itself. Only when I identify with my people do I cease being a mere statistic, a meaningless number, and become a human being. American Indians share a magnificent history, rich in its astounding diversity, its integrity, its spirituality, its ongoing unique culture and dynamic tradition. It's also rich, I'm saddened to say, in tragedy, deceit, and genocide. Our sovereignty, our nationhood, our very identity, along with our sacred lands, have been stolen from us in one of the great thefts of human history. And I am referring not just to the thefts of previous centuries, but to the great thefts that are still being perpetrated upon us today, at this very moment. Our human rights as indigenous peoples are being violated every day of our lives, and by the very same people who loudly and sanctimoniously proclaim to other nations the moral necessity of such rights. Over the centuries, our sacred lands have been repeatedly and routinely stolen from us by the governments and peoples of the United States and Canada. They callously pushed us onto remote reservations on what they thought was worthless wasteland, trying to sweep us under the rug of history. But today, that so-called wasteland has surprisingly become enormously valuable as the relentless technology of white society continues its determined assault on Mother Earth. White society would now like to terminate us as peoples and push us off our reservations so they can steal our remaining mineral and oil resources. It's nothing new for them to steal from non-white peoples. When the oppressors succeed with their illegal thefts and depredations, it's called colonialism. When their efforts to colonize indigenous peoples are met with resistance or anything but abject surrender, it's called war. When the colonized peoples attempt to resist their oppression and defend themselves, we're called criminals. I write this book to bring about a greater understanding of what being an Indian means, of who we are as human beings. We're not quaint curiosities or stereotypical figures in a movie, but ordinary, and yes, at times extraordinary, human beings, just like you. We feel, we bleed, we are born, we die. We aren't stuffed dummies in front of a souvenir shop. We aren't sports mascots for teams like the Redskins, or the Indians, or the Braves, or 1,000 others who steal and distort and ridicule our likeness. Imagine if they called their teams the Washington Whiteskins, or the Washington Blackskins. Then you'd see a protest. With all else that's been taken from us, we ask that you leave us our name, our self-respect, our sense of belonging to the great human family of which we are all part. Our voice, our collective voice, our eagle's cry is just beginning to be heard. We call out to all of humanity, hear us! Chapter 10. Often I see Indians fighting Indians, bad-mouthing each other and worse. My white friends ask me, why can't you Indians get together and act in unison? Why? Do white people speak with one voice on all issues? Why should we? Should Indians be under some form of dictatorship that would keep us all in line? That's precisely what we're trying to avoid. We can't give up our freedom in order to keep our freedom. We will assure our own survival only by acting as free men and free women, which we are. Free. At least in our minds, and in our hearts, and in our dreams. Even if our bodies are shackled and locked away. We each speak our piece. That's our duty to our people. That's why each of us is a leader. That's Indian way. That's true democracy, not a dictatorship of the elite and powerful who get themselves elected and then make secret deals on their own behalf behind the people's backs. They have no beliefs, such people, but their own self-interests. They care nothing for others, or for the earth, or for the seventh generation. We oppose such people and the system that they have created by and for themselves. We believe many, many among you, peoples of all races and nations, join us in this opposition. We ask, we demand that our voices be heard in the councils of humanity. Someone must speak for the earth and the seventh generation. There should be delegations of indigenous people at every national conference and at every international conference. We are the voices of the earth. We speak for those who are not yet born. When you exclude us, you exclude your own conscience. We are your conscience. An eagle's cry. Listen to me. Listen. I am the Indian voice. Hear me crying out of the wind. Hear me crying out of the silence. I am the Indian voice. Listen to me. I speak for our ancestors. They cry out to you from the unstill grave. I speak for the children yet unborn. They cry out to you from the unspoken silence. I am the Indian voice. Listen to me. I am a chorus of millions. Hear us. Our eagle cry will not be stilled. We are your own conscience calling to you. We are you yourself, crying unheard within you. Let my unheard voice be heard. Let me speak in my heart and the words be heard. Whispering on the wind to millions, to all who care, to all with ears to hear and hearts to beat as one with mine. Put your ear to the earth and hear my heart beating there. Put your ear to the wind and hear me speaking there. We are the voice of the earth, of the future, of the mystery. Hear us! Chapter 11. My own personal story can't be told, even in this abbreviated version, without going back long before my own birth on September 12, 1944. Back to 1890, and to 1876, and to 1868, and to 1851, and yes, all the way back through all those other calamitous dates in the relations between red men and white, back to that darkest day of all in human history, October 12th, 1492, when our great sorrow began. But for our limited purposes in these pages, let's get past all those earlier dates and settle here for the beginning of my story in 1890, that crucial and terrible year when we and the sacred hoop of our nation were finally broken. Or so they thought. Whenever I think of the Holocaust that occurred at Wounded Knee, South Dakota on December 29th, 1890, I hear the voices of the children crying out from the cold and hunger and terror. I hear the wails and lamentations of the mothers weeping in agony for their dying babies. The stories passed on to me by the Lakota elders describe the incredible suffering of Chief Bigfoot and his starving followers as they fled through the vicious Dakota winter on their way to Pine Ridge that terrible December day. Just 2 weeks after the utterly unprovoked murder of Sitting Bull, who was murdered through treachery, like so many others of our people. Bigfoot's band, fleeing for their lives, didn't know why they were being targeted and killed. They were heading for refuge with Red Cloud's band at Pine Ridge. Ostensibly, claimed the government, they sent their troops to stop us from performing the ghost dance, a purely religious rite. This was just a pretext, of course. They are very good to this day at finding pretexts to attack us. The real reason behind their attack was that they wanted to run their railroads from the stolen Black Hills back to Chicago and the East, right through what was left of our lands, which the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had solemnly promised to us for as long as the grass grows and the rivers run. When Bigfoot's starving, freezing band saw the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit, moving towards them through the deep snow, they figured the cavalry could only be there to help them, surely. Hadn't they been told that if they surrendered to the Indian agency at Pine Ridge, they would be cared for with food and medicine and shelter? I can physically feel at this very moment the misery and suffering that more than 300 men, women, and children endured as they made their way through South Dakota blizzards, below zero temperatures, and impenetrable snowdrifts. I can imagine the terror and the fear rushing through them as the soldiers opened fire on them the following morning. The echoes and roar of Gatling guns mixed with the booming of cannons and rattling of sabers and the screams of women and children. As an Indian of Sioux blood, I can hear those screams and feel the pain of those mothers, children, and old men as they are torn to pieces by the bullets and the flashing blood-tipped sabers, striking them again and again and again as they lay there defenseless. I relive every one of their deaths. I die with each one of them again and again. Chief Bigfoot's band had refused to fight the Wasichu, white man, believing only peace could overcome the animosity between the people. Bigfoot himself was an old man at the time, nearly dead of pneumonia. They surrendered to the cavalry, camped at Wounded Knee Creek, ate a meager meal much like the final meal of the condemned before execution, slept a few hours, and then that next morning were promptly slaughtered. Allegedly because one old Indian, probably deaf, had raised his rifle rather than surrender to a soldier. Somehow the gun went off, or so the government claimed, and the Gatling guns and cannons up on the hill fired right down into the people. They even killed a few dozen of their own soldiers standing there. Afterward, the proud butchers of the 7th Cavalry were awarded 26 medals of honor for their heroics. White man's history books still call it a battle, as if to give some dignity to what had none. It was a slaughter, pure and simple, a crime against all humanity, though there was no such phrase in those days. The late James Highhawk, one of the few survivors of the Wounded Knee Massacre, gave this eyewitness account. My mother was crying and trying to save and protect her small family. And I was myself just a little boy. A soldier came to where we were hiding and shot my mother and baby brother and myself as my mother pleaded for our lives. I was wounded and lay there for hours until Oglalas, Lakotas, from Pine Ridge saved me. This massacre is the most disgraceful, cowardly, and treacherous killing ever staged by the United States Army. White people say that Indians are treacherous, but we are not. We love our families. We do not bother the white people, but they came here and killed us, woman and child. We have the wounds to prove what they have done. Yes, we have the wounds. And these atrocities against my people continue to this day, only now they're carried out with more sophisticated means than Gatling guns and cannons and sabers. There are subtler ways of killing. Call it death by statistics. Today, white man lets his statistics do the killing for him. Indian reservations in South Dakota have the highest rates of poverty and unemployment and the highest rates of infant mortality and teenage suicide, along with the lowest standard of living and the lowest life expectancy, barely 40 years in the country. Those statistics amount to genocide. Genocide also disguises itself in the form of poor health facilities, and wretched housing, and inadequate schooling, and rampant corruption. Our remaining lands, eyed by 1,000 local schemers only too eager to stir up trouble and division on the reservation, continue to be sold off acre by acre to pay off tribal and individual debts. No square inch of our ever-shrinking territory seems beyond the greedy designs of those who would drive us into non-existence. The American Indian movement through the years has sought every means possible to bring these crimes against humanity to the attention of the world, hoping that at least some of you would listen and search deep within yourselves for the humanity to demand that the U.S. government stop these crimes. The destruction of our people must stop. We are not statistics. We are the people from whom you took this land by force and blood and lies. We are the people to whom you promised to pay, in recompense for this vast continent you stole, some small pittance to assure at least our bare survival. And we are the people from whom you now snatch away even that pittance, abandoning us and your own honor without a qualm, even launching military attacks on our women and children and elders, and targeting, illegally, even by your own self-serving laws, those of us, our remaining warriors, who would dare stand up and try to defend them. You practice crimes against humanity at the same time you piously speak to the rest of the world of human rights. America, when will you live up to your own principles? Chapter 12. First beginning in the mid-1950s, a new generation of Indian men and women began protesting violations by the state and federal governments with a renewed resolve and militance. And since those early days, we have actively refused to accept our continued victimhood. In the late 1960s, we discovered an old law that said Indians have the first right to surplus land abandoned by the federal government. So we decided to test that law, to test whether any law was true when it came to Indians. In California, in November 1969, Indians occupied Alcatraz Island, site of the notorious federal prison abandoned in 1963. Our Alcatraz occupiers declared our intention to turn the island into a Native Peoples Cultural Center. The first building to be seen by visitors coming through the Golden Gate, that, at least, would symbolize whom all this vast, wonderful land had been stolen from. A few months later, in 1970, some of us occupied abandoned Fort Lawson outside Seattle as well. I was personally involved in that. Eventually, I'm proud to say, Fort Lawson did become a Native Cultural Center. All of these actions were carried out peacefully. We didn't ask for violence. None of us wanted to lose our freedom and spend the rest of our lives in prison. We were simply invoking one of the United States' own laws. But the opposition, not surprisingly, didn't see it our way. Especially given the hate-mongering of the times, we were called thugs and commies and invaders. Men, women, and children were beaten, and much worse when the Indians were arrested during the fishing rights protests. At Fort Lawson, the government confronted us with machine guns and flamethrowers. When we were arrested, the soldiers fondled the women in front of the men, trying to trick us into reacting so they could justify killing us. Those of us singled out as leaders were beaten in our military jail cells in the army stockade. I refused to leave until every one of our group of warriors was allowed to leave. That got me several extra beatings, since white man loves to separate the bros from each other, get us to rat on each other, create distrust among us, beat us one by one while laughing out loud that the others have already double-crossed us, when, of course, they hadn't. It's an old strategy. Divide and conquer, they call it. I've learned that the best way to be beaten is to relax as best you can while clenching your stomach muscles, protect your head and genitals, and think of Sundance. Sure, it hurts so bad sometimes you think you're going to die, or at least be crippled for life, and maybe you will. But somehow, thankfully, you survive. We Indians are survivors. That pain only makes me stronger, more determined. That pain is my people's pain, and I'm proud to bear it for them. The events at Alcatraz and Fort Lawson were inspiring to Indian people. In South Dakota, young warriors, men and women, began to rise up. In the early 1970s, the traditional people of the Oglala Lakota Nation on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation organized protests against the poverty and horrendous living conditions. Indian people were living in old car bodies and flimsy shacks, dispossessed by the very government sworn to protect them in its own constitution. The ugliest sort of racism, overt and undisguised, was rampant in towns bordering the reservation. Towns where abusing and beating and torturing and even murdering Indians was a winked-at blood sport. I trace the roots of my own political activism to the rank racism and brutal poverty I experienced every day as an Indian child growing up on the Turtle Mountain, Chippewa, and Fort Totten Sioux reservations in North Dakota.